The year was 1884, and the wind across the Dakota plains had a voice. It was not a gentle whisper, it was a mournful cry that scoured the land, stripping the color from the grass and leaving behind a brittle, dun-colored memory of summer. For Isaac Prescott, the wind was just another form of silence. It filled the spaces that his own thoughts could not, a constant, keening companion in the vast emptiness he called home. His ranch was a lonely outpost, a handful of sturdy buildings huddled against the immense, indifferent sky. He had built the cabin with his own 2 hands, for a life that had vanished before it had truly begun. Isaac's days were carved into a rigid routine, a bulwark against the tide of memory that threatened to pull him under. He rose before the sun painted the eastern horizon, his movements precise and economical. He mended fences that bordered nothing but more emptiness, his hammer blows a stark punctuation in the quiet. He tended to his small herd of cattle, their lowing the only conversation he held most days. He chopped wood until his shoulders ached, the clean, sharp scent of pine a welcome distraction. Each task was a stone laid upon a grave, a deliberate act of forgetting, but grief was a persistent phantom. It sat with him at his supper table, a vacant space where his wife, Mary, should have been. It echoed in the profound stillness of the bedroom, where the cradle he had sanded smooth stood empty. 2 years. 2 years since he had buried both his wife and their newborn son on the same bleak afternoon, the raw earth a wound in the prairie. He had become a man made of edges and silence, his heart a locked room whose key he had long since thrown away. He moved through his life like a ghost, his own presence barely registering. The man who had once laughed easily, whose blue eyes had held a spark of boundless optimism, was gone. In his place was this hardened shell, a man who spoke only when necessary and felt even less. The isolation was a kind of penance, a self-imposed exile. He wanted nothing, asked for nothing, and expected nothing. The land was harsh, demanding, and in its unforgiving nature, he found a strange sort of comfort. It did not offer false hope or easy solace. It simply was, vast and immutable, a mirror to the desolation within him. One morning in late October, the world woke up wrong. A cold front had swept down from the north with unnatural speed, bringing with it a biting, wet snow that was weeks too early. The flakes were thick and heavy, clinging to the branches of the few scraggly cottonwoods and blurring the sharp lines of the horizon. It was a treacherous snow, the kind that could trap and kill a man or his livestock if they were caught unprepared. A deep unease settled in Isaac's gut as he pulled on his heaviest coat. He had a fence line miles to the west that ran alongside a series of rocky outcrops, a place where cattle could get foolishly trapped in a sudden storm. Leaving it to chance was not in his nature. He saddled his steady gelding, Old Bill, the horse's breath pluming in the frigid air. The world was a swirl of white and grey, the wind driving the snow into his face with stinging force. It was a fool's errand, he knew, but the routine was all he had. For hours he rode, leaning into the wind, his world shrinking to the space between his horse's ears. He was nearing the outcrops, the dark slash of rock barely visible through the curtain of snow, when Old Bill suddenly shied, snorting and tossing his head. The horse was not prone to spooking. Isaac pulled him to a halt, his hand resting on the stock of the rifle in his saddle scabbard. He strained his eyes, peering into the maelstrom. At first, he thought it was a wounded animal, a dark shape huddled at the base of the rocks, a pathetic mound against the rising drifts. He dismounted, his boots sinking into the wet, heavy snow. As he drew closer, the shape resolved itself. It was a person, a woman, cloaked in worn hides, her black hair matted with snow. She was collapsed, almost entirely buried, her body a fragile shield over something else. He saw a flicker of movement, a tiny, twitching motion from beneath her. He reached her in a few long strides, his heart hammering against his ribs with an unfamiliar urgency. He knelt, his knees sinking into the freezing ground. The woman's face was ashen, her lips a faint, bluish purple. Her eyes were closed, her breathing a shallow, ragged whisper. She was Lakota, That much was clear from her garments and the lines of her face, but she was impossibly far from any known encampment. As he gently tried to move her, a low moan escaped her lips, a sound of profound agony and despair. It was then he saw what she was protecting. Tucked into the curve of her body, wrapped in layers of rabbit fur and buckskin, were two infants. They were terrifyingly small, their faces pinched and pale. They were not crying, they were not moving. A cold dread, sharper than the wind, pierced through Isaac's layers of detachment. He had seen death too many times. He touched one tiny cheek. It was colder than the snow. For a long moment, he was paralyzed. The sheer, desperate tragedy of the scene rooted him to the spot. This woman and her children were dying. The prairie was claiming them, as it claimed everything eventually. The old Isaac, the man he was before, would have recoiled from this, would have seen it as the will of a cruel God. The current Isaac, the man of routine and stone, felt the instinct to turn away, to ride back to the shelter of his silent cabin and let the storm finish its work. It was not his concern. It was not his grief to bear. But as he looked at the woman's face, at the fierce, unconscious instinct that made her curl her freezing body around her young, something cracked open inside him. He saw not a stranger, not an Indian, but a mother. It was an image that sliced through his defenses with the precision of a surgeon's blade, laying bare the wound he kept so carefully hidden. He saw Mary's face in his mind, pale and exhausted after her own labor. He saw the small, still form of his son. A sound tore from his own throat, a raw curse against the wind and the sky and the whole damned, empty world. He could not leave them. He could not be the kind of man who rode away from this. That man, at least, was not dead. With a surge of desperate energy, he began to work. He gently disentangled the infants from their mother's arms. They were impossibly light. He unbuttoned his heavy sheepskin coat, pulling it open to the biting wind. He placed the two small bundles against his own chest, against the warmth of his body, and buttoned the coat over them. He then turned back to the woman. She was a dead weight, but fueled by a sudden, fierce adrenaline, he managed to lift her, draping her over his shoulder in a fireman's carry. The journey back was a waking nightmare. Every step was a battle against the wind and the deepening snow. The woman's weight was a crushing burden, and the fragile lives against his chest were a terrifying responsibility. He spoke to them, his voice rough and strange in the howling gale. "Hold on," he muttered, the words snatched away by the wind. "Just hold on." He spoke to the horse, to the woman, to the babies, to the ghost of his wife. It was a prayer, a promise, a frantic plea against the encroaching silence. When he finally stumbled into his own yard, the lights of his cabin, a beacon in the swirling dark, he was not sure if any of them, including himself, were still alive. He half-carried, half-dragged the woman inside, laying her on the rag rug before the cold hearth. He did not have the strength to get her to the bed. He stripped off his coat and gently laid the two infants on his own cot, their stillness a terrifying accusation. He worked with a grim, focused intensity that banished all thought. He built a fire, the flames catching quickly, greedily, and beginning to push back the bone-deep chill in the room. He stripped the woman of her wet, frozen hides, his movements clinical, impersonal. Her body was thin, her ribs stark beneath the skin, but she was alive. He wrapped her in every spare blanket he owned and propped her head on a pillow. Then he turned to the babies. He was clumsy, his large, calloused hands shaking as he unwrapped them. They were a boy and a girl, twins, so small they looked like porcelain dolls. Their skin was mottled and cold, but as the warmth of the cabin began to seep into them, he saw a faint flush of color return. He found a soft, old flannel shirt of Mary's tucked away in a chest, a relic he had not been able to part with. The scent of lavender and cedar rose from the fabric, a ghostly perfume that struck him like a physical blow. He tore the shirt into strips, his vision blurring. He used the soft cloth to gently, methodically, rub warmth back into their tiny limbs. He worked for what felt like hours, his world shrinking to this single desperate task. He heated some cow's milk, thinning it with boiled water, just as the doctor had instructed him for his own son. He dipped a corner of a clean rag into the warm liquid and squeezed a few drops into the boy's mouth. The baby coughed, sputtered, and then, miraculously, began to suckle weakly. A cry, thin and reedy as a bird's call, broke the silence. It was the most beautiful sound Isaac had ever heard. He turned to the girl and did the same. She, too, responded, her own small cry joining her brother's. The cabin, so long a tomb of silence, was suddenly, shockingly, filled with the sound of life. Isaac sank back on his heels, a wave of exhaustion and relief so profound it almost buckled him. He had done it. They were alive. He looked from the squirming, crying infants to their mother, who was now stirring by the fire. Her eyes fluttered open. They were dark and deep, and for a moment they were filled with a terrifying, wild panic. Her gaze darted around the strange room, landing on him, a white man, and then on her children, lying on his bed. A look of pure, animal terror crossed her face. "Easy now," Isaac said, his voice low and calm, holding up his hands to show they were empty. "You're safe. Your children are safe." Her eyes narrowed. They were filled with a suspicion as deep and cold as the storm outside. She did not trust him. He did not expect her to. He just watched her, a silent guardian, as the fire crackled and the twins cried, and the world outside the cabin windows slowly vanished into a fury of white. In the flickering firelight, he got his first proper look at the infants. He gently wiped the boy's face with a damp corner of the cloth. The baby blinked, his little fists uncurling. And Isaac Prescott froze. Staring back at him, wide and impossibly clear in the small, wrinkled face, were two eyes the color of a summer sky. They were a startling, piercing blue, the exact shade of blue as his own. The exact shade of blue as his lost Mary's. The sight was so unexpected, so impossible, it felt like a punch to the gut. He looked from the boy to the girl. Her eyes, too, were the same brilliant, shocking blue. He stared at them, then at their dark-haired, dark-eyed mother lying by the fire, and 1,000 questions, none of which had an answer, crashed down upon him. The lonely cowboy who had found them saw his own blue eyes staring back, and the silence in his heart was shattered forever. The first days were a delicate, silent truce. The woman, whose name he did not know, recovered slowly. She was weakened by childbirth and starvation, and she spent most of her time sleeping by the hearth, a fitful, haunted sleep. When she was awake, she watched him. Her gaze was a tangible thing, a weight in the small cabin. It was a look of profound distrust, sharp and wary as a cornered wolf's. Isaac understood it. In her world, a man with his face was a threat, a harbinger of violence and loss. Kindness from such a man was more suspect than cruelty. He kept his distance, moving with a quiet purpose that he hoped was reassuring. His words were few and strictly functional. "There's broth on the stove," he'd say, leaving a bowl on a crate near her blankets. "The milk is warm for the babes." He never approached her directly unless necessary, never made a sudden move. He was the caretaker of the space, the provider of warmth and food, but she was the silent, watchful queen of her small territory by the fire. Caring for the twins consumed him. It was an awkward, fumbling process. His large, rough hands, so accustomed to the heft of an axe or the reins of a horse, struggled with the delicate task of swaddling and feeding. He felt like a clumsy giant tending to fragile sparrows. Yet, in this clumsiness, he found a strange sort of grace. The simple, overwhelming needs of the infants forced him out of the prison of his own mind. He could not dwell on his own loss when a tiny mouth was searching for sustenance, when a thin cry pierced the air demanding comfort. The blue eyes of the twins were a constant, unnerving miracle. Every time he looked at them, he felt a jolt, a painful echo of Mary. It was a ghost in his house, a memory made flesh. He found himself talking to them in low murmurs as he worked, the way he had once talked to the swell of Mary's belly. "There now, little man," he'd whisper to the boy. "Settle down, little miss," he'd coo at the girl. It was a conversation with the past, with the future he'd been denied, and it was slowly, imperceptibly, prying open the locked rooms of his heart. After 4 days, the woman finally sat up on her own. She was still weak, but a flicker of strength had returned to her dark eyes. She watched as Isaac clumsily tried to change one of the babies, who was wailing with indignation. Without a word, she pushed her blankets aside and rose unsteadily to her feet. She walked over to the cot, her movements stiff but resolute. She held out her hands. Isaac hesitated for a fraction of a second, then carefully handed the crying infant to her. The moment the baby was in her arms, he fell silent. She held him with an innate, effortless confidence that Isaac could only envy. Her hands, though thin, were sure and gentle. She murmured something to the child in her own language, a soft, flowing sound like water over stones. It was the first time he had heard her voice used for anything other than a moan of pain. From that moment, a subtle shift occurred. She took over the primary care of the children. It was her right, her purpose. A silent understanding passed between them. He would provide the food, the shelter, the wood for the fire. She would nurture. The cabin, which had been his solitary domain, now had two distinct spheres of influence. His was the world of iron and wood, of the outdoors. Hers was the world of warmth and flesh, of the hearth and the cradle he had moved near the fire. The silence between them began to change. It was no longer the heavy, suspicious silence of the first few days. It became a shared quiet, a space they inhabited together. They ate their meals at the small table, the sound of their utensils and the gurgling of the babies, the only noise. Isaac found himself watching her, the efficient grace of her movements, the fierce, protective love in her eyes, whenever she looked at her children. He saw a strength in her that humbled him, a resilience forged in a fire he could scarcely imagine. One evening, as the wind howled outside, rattling the window panes, one of the babies, the boy, began to cry with a feverish, distressed wail. His small body was hot to the touch, and his breathing was shallow. A familiar, cold fear seized Isaac. He saw his own son, his skin flushed with the fever that had ultimately taken him. The woman looked up at him, her face a mask of controlled panic. In that moment, they were not a white man and an Indian woman. They were two parents, terrified for their child. All night, they worked together. He kept the fire roaring, boiled water, and brought cool cloths. She held the baby, sponging his small body, murmuring her soft, constant lullabies. They moved around each other in a seamless, unspoken dance. They were a team, united against the specter of death that hovered in the room. Towards dawn, the fever broke. The boy's breathing eased, and he fell into a deep, healing sleep. The woman sagged with relief, her head bowed over her son. Isaac brought her a mug of hot, sweet coffee. She took it, her fingers brushing his. It was the first time they had touched. Her eyes met his over the rim of the mug, and for the first time, the suspicion was gone. In its place was a flicker of something else, gratitude, a shared understanding. "He is strong," Isaac said, his voice hoarse from lack of sleep. She nodded, her gaze returning to her son. After a long moment of silence, she spoke, her voice quiet but clear. "Winona." Isaac blinked. "I'm sorry?" "My name," she said, looking at him again. "It is Winona." It was an offering, a bridge across the chasm that had separated them. "Isaac," he replied, the name feeling strange on his own lips. "My name is Isaac." That night, something fundamental was settled between them. The next evening, as she nursed the little girl, she spoke again. Her English was hesitant, learned from traders and the reservation school she had attended as a child, but her meaning was clear. She told him why she had been out in the storm. She had been cast out by her people, the Lakota. To give birth to twins was rare, sometimes seen as a powerful blessing, but sometimes as a dangerous imbalance. To give birth to twins with the pale skin and sky-colored eyes of the white man was a curse, an undeniable sign of impurity, of a tainted spirit. My grandmother's mother, she explained, her voice low. She was taken in a raid, a white woman with hair like the sun. The old one said her blood was forgotten, but it was only sleeping. Her people, steeped in fear and tradition, and swayed by a rival who had wanted her for his own, saw the babies as an ill omen, a violation of their bloodlines. They had not killed her outright. Instead, they had performed the crueler ritual of abandonment, leaving her and her unnatural offspring to the judgment of the spirits and the unforgiving prairie. Isaac listened, a cold anger building in his chest. He looked at the perfect, tiny infant in Winona's arms, then at her brother sleeping peacefully. A curse? They were a miracle. They were wrong, he said, his voice harder than he intended. Winona looked at him, her expression unreadable. It is their way, she said, a statement of fact, not of acceptance. But he saw the pain in her eyes, the profound wound of being rejected by everyone she had ever known. He saw her loneliness, and it was a mirror to his own. They were two outcasts, adrift in the vast, empty landscape, finding unexpected harbor in each other's presence. As the days bled into weeks, the cabin transformed. It was no longer a silent monument to grief. It was a home, noisy and messy, and vibrantly alive. The strict routines Isaac had built to keep his sorrow at bay crumbled, replaced by a new rhythm dictated by the needs of the twins. He found himself smiling, a strange and rusty motion of his facial muscles. He would watch Winona as she sang to the babies, her voice weaving stories of animal spirits and ancient heroes, and a warmth would spread through his chest, a feeling he had thought he would never experience again. He began to talk to her, not just about practical matters, but about himself. He told her about the ranch, about his dream of building it into something that would last. He spoke of the land, of his respect for its power and beauty. He never spoke of Mary. The subject was a locked door deep inside him, and he was not yet ready to open it. But Winona did not press. She was a patient, perceptive listener, and he had the sense that she understood far more than he said. One afternoon, she was mending one of his shirts, her stitches small and neat. She held it up. "You are a good man, Isaac Prescott," she said simply. The words, so direct and unadorned, struck him with surprising force. He just grunted in response, embarrassed, and turned his attention back to oiling a piece of harness. But her words stayed with him. He had not thought of himself as a good man in a very long time. He was just a man who survived. But looking at the scene before him, the fire crackling, the babies sleeping, this quiet, strong woman mending his clothes, wondered if perhaps she was right. Perhaps, buried under all the grief and bitterness, the man he was supposed to be was still there. Perhaps this strange, unexpected family, born of a blizzard and an act of desperation, was not just saving him from loneliness, perhaps it was saving his soul. The deep winter locked them in its icy grip. Snow piled in great drifts against the cabin, and the world outside the windows became a landscape of stark white and shadow. The isolation was absolute. No one could get in, and they could not get out. For some, it would have been a prison. For Isaac and Winona, it became a sanctuary. The small, warm cabin was their entire world, a haven against the howling ferocity of the elements. Inside its walls, their fragile, unspoken bond deepened. They developed a comfortable domesticity, a partnership that flowed with the natural grace of water finding its course. He chopped the wood that kept them warm, she cooked the food that kept them strong. He would return from tending the livestock covered in snow to find the cabin filled with the scent of stew and the soft sounds of the babies. She would look up and offer a small, quiet smile, and it was enough to thaw the chill from his bones. She named the twins. The boy she called Chaitan, the Lakota word for falcon, for the fierce spirit she saw in him. The girl she named Wachiwi, meaning dancer, for the way her little legs would kick and move as if to some unheard music. Isaac found himself using the names, rolling the unfamiliar syllables on his tongue until they became as natural as his own. Chaitan and Wachiwi. They were no longer just the babies, they were individuals, small people with nascent personalities. Chaitan was solemn and observant, his blue eyes taking in everything with a serious intensity. Wachiwi was bright and expressive, quick to smile and gurgle with delight. One evening, Isaac was carving a small wooden bird for Wachiwi, the shavings falling onto the hearth. Winona was humming a lullaby to Chaitan. The peace in the room was so profound, so complete, that it felt almost fragile, as if a single loud noise could shatter it. It was in that moment of quiet contentment that Isaac found the courage to unlock the door he had kept bolted for so long. "My wife," he began, his voice rough, startling them both. Her name was Mary. Winona stopped humming. She looked at him, her expression patient, inviting. She did not speak, simply waited for him to continue. She had eyes like theirs," he said, gesturing with the half-carved bird toward the sleeping twins. "The same blue. I never saw that color on anyone else. Until them." He swallowed, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "We were to have a son, but there were complications. The fever came. I lost them both." He stared into the fire, the flames blurring through a sudden film of tears. "This cabin, it was supposed to be for them, for our family. After they were gone, it was just an empty box, full of silence." He had not spoken these words aloud to anyone. Saying them now felt like lancing a wound, a terrible, necessary pain. Winona rose and came to sit on the hearth near him. She did not touch him, did not offer platitudes. She simply sat with him in his sorrow, her presence a solid, comforting anchor in the storm of his memory. "The silence is gone now," she said softly after a long time. He looked at her strong, calm face illuminated by the firelight, and he knew she was right. The silence had been filled. It had been filled by the cries of infants, by the whisper of her songs, by the shared rhythm of their breathing in the night. The house was no longer an empty box. It was a home again, a different home than the one he had planned, a family stitched together from the scraps of broken lives, but a home nonetheless. A profound gratitude for this woman, for the children she had brought into his life, washed over him. It was a feeling so powerful it left him breathless. But the sanctuary of the winter could not last forever. As the snows began to recede with the first hints of a spring thaw, a new tension entered their lives. The world was returning. Isaac knew that their isolation was a fragile shield. The nearest town, Redemption, was a full day's ride away, a place of hard-bitten men and suspicious gossips. How would they react to his new family? To a white rancher, living with an Indian woman and her two strange blue-eyed children, prejudice was a currency as common as dirt on the frontier. An even more immediate threat loomed, however, a threat from Winona's past. One afternoon, as she stood in the doorway, looking out at the melting snow, Isaac saw a shadow cross her face. "They will come," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Who will come?" Isaac asked, though he already knew the answer. "My people, to see if the spirits have finished their work." Her eyes met his, and he saw fear in them for the first time since that first night. "There is a man, Kangi. He is a warrior. He wanted me for his wife. When I chose another, he was shamed. When my husband died of the coughing sickness, Kangi saw it as his chance, but I refused him again. The birth of my children, he used it. He stoked the people's fear. He said I had brought a curse upon our band. He will want to be sure the curse has been erased." Isaac's hand went instinctively to the Winchester rifle that rested on pegs above the mantelpiece. He was not a violent man, but the thought of anyone threatening Winona or the twins ignited a cold, protective fury in him. "This is your home now," he said, his voice low and steady. "This is their home. No one will harm you here." Her gaze softened with a gratitude that made his heart ache. But the fear remained. They were no longer just battling the elements. They were now set to face the judgment of men, and Isaac knew that could be a far colder and more brutal force than any winter storm. The fragile peace of their winter sanctuary was over. The world was coming for them. The confrontation came sooner than he expected. It was a grey, grim day in early March, the sky the color of lead, and the air still holding a deep chill. Isaac was splitting logs in the yard when he saw them, 4 riders cresting the low hill to the east. They were not cowboys or travelers. They were Lakota warriors, their figures stark and imposing against the dreary sky. They rode with a grim purpose, their horses moving at a steady, deliberate pace. Isaac's blood ran cold. He calmly set down his axe, his eyes never leaving the approaching riders. He wiped his hands on his trousers and walked into the cabin. Winona was by the window, her face pale. She was holding Wachiwi, clutching the baby to her chest as if to absorb her into her own body. "Stay inside, lock the door," Isaac commanded, his voice tight. He took the Winchester from its pegs, his movements fluid and practiced. He checked the action, feeling the familiar, reassuring weight of the rifle in his hands. "Isaac, no," Winona pleaded, her voice trembling. "Do not shed blood for us." "I won't start anything," he said, his eyes meeting hers. "But I will finish it if they try to harm you." He gave her a hard, quick look, a look that conveyed all the unspoken promises that had grown between them. Then he stepped outside, pulling the door shut behind him. He stood on the porch, the rifle held loosely at his side, not aimed, but ready. He was 1 man against 4, but this was his land, this was his home. A fierce, primal possessiveness rose in him. He would not yield it. The riders stopped a respectful distance from the cabin. The one in the lead, a broad-shouldered man with a hard, unforgiving face, was clearly the leader. It had to be Kangi. His eyes swept over Isaac, dismissing him, then fixed on the cabin door. "We have come for the woman," Kangi called out in heavily accented English, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "She carries a curse. She must be returned to the spirits." "The woman is under my protection," Isaac replied, his voice calm and even, carrying easily in the still air. "She and her children are not cursed. They are guests in my home." Kangi's lip curled in a sneer. "You shelter this impurity? The white man protects the stain in the blood. She does not belong here. She belongs to the earth." He was not speaking of murder, but of destiny, of a spiritual cleansing he felt duty, bound to see fulfilled. "The only impurity I see here is the hatred in your heart," Isaac said, his grip tightening on the rifle stock. "She was left to die. That is a coward's act, not a warrior's." A flicker of anger crossed Kangi's face. He exchanged a look with the men beside him. They were tense, their hands resting near their own weapons. The air crackled with unspoken violence. It was a standoff, a fragile moment that could shatter into bloodshed with a single wrong move. Just as the tension reached its breaking point, the cabin door creaked open. Winona stepped out onto the porch. She had wrapped Chaitan in his thickest furs and held him firmly in her arms. Her face was no longer pale with fear. It was set with a resolve that seemed carved from stone. She walked to the edge of the porch to stand beside Isaac, a silent, unshakable declaration of unity. "Kangi," she said, her voice clear and strong, speaking in her own tongue. It was a voice Isaac had never heard before, filled with a ringing authority that commanded attention. The warriors straightened, their focus shifting entirely to her. "I am not a curse," she declared, her eyes locking with Kangi's. "I am a mother. The spirits did not abandon me in the snow. They sent a protector. They did not judge my children. They sent a good man to give them shelter and warmth." She took a step forward, her gaze sweeping over the other men. "You speak of tradition, you speak of pure blood. But what tradition demands that a mother and her babies be left for the wolves? What purity is there in such cruelty? You followed a man blinded by his own pride. You allowed fear to make you weak." She lifted Chaitan slightly, so they could all see him. The baby, roused by the cold air, opened his eyes. Those brilliant, impossible blue eyes stared out from his swaddling, calm and unafraid. He looked directly at Kangi. "My children will live," Winona said, her voice dropping to a fierce, low intensity. "They will live because their mother is strong. They will live because a man with a brave heart chose kindness over judgment. This is my home now. This is my family. My life is here. I renounce the law that would have killed me. I renounce the judgment of men who have forgotten what it means to be human." A profound silence fell over the yard. The wind whispered through the bare branches of the cottonwoods. Kangi stared at her, his hard face a mask of conflicting emotions. He saw before him not the shamed, cast-out woman he had condemned, but a leader, a matriarch defending her kin with a power greater than any weapon. He saw the healthy, blue-eyed child in her arms, a living refutation of his prophecy. He saw the white man standing beside her, not as a conqueror, but as a guardian, his rifle held ready, but his eyes fixed on Winona with an expression of pure, unadulterated respect. The foundation of his certainty, of his righteous anger, began to crumble. He had come expecting to find evidence of a curse fulfilled, perhaps a lonely man driven mad by ghosts. Instead, he found a family, strong and defiant. He had lost, not to the white man's gun, but to the woman's spirit. With a sharp, guttural sound of frustration and defeat, Kangi wrenched his horse's head around. He looked at Winona one last time, a look of grudging, bitter respect in his eyes. Then, without another word, he spurred his horse and rode away, his men following like shadows behind him. They disappeared over the hill, swallowed by the grey landscape, leaving only silence in their wake. The immediate threat was gone. Isaac slowly lowered the rifle, the tension draining out of him, leaving him feeling weak-kneed. He looked at Winona. She was trembling slightly, the aftermath of her immense courage, but her head was held high. She turned to him, her dark eyes shining with unshed tears. He reached out, not thinking, and placed his hand on her arm, over the fabric of her sleeve. It was a simple gesture of support, of awe. "Winona," he started, but he had no words for what he felt. She leaned into his touch for a fraction of a second, a silent acknowledgement of everything that had just passed between them. Then she took a deep breath, straightened her shoulders, and carried her son back into the warmth of the cabin, back to their home. The battle was over. They had won. In the days that followed, the last of the winter's ice melted from the land and from their hearts. The confrontation with Kangi had been a crucible, burning away the last vestiges of doubt and uncertainty. They were no longer just a man and a woman sharing a roof out of necessity. They were a unit, bound by a shared ordeal and a fierce, mutual respect. That evening, sitting by the fire, Isaac finally found the words he had been seeking. He looked at Winona as she rocked Wachiwi, her profile softened by the flickering light. "When I found you," he said quietly, "I was already dead. I was just too stubborn to lie down. This house was a tomb. I was a ghost." He looked around the cabin, at the cradle, at the small items of clothing drying by the fire, at the life that filled every corner. "You brought it all back. You and Chaitan and Wachiwi. You filled the silence." She looked up at him, a deep, gentle wisdom in her eyes. "And you, Isaac Prescott," she replied softly, "you gave us a world when ours had cast us out. We were all ghosts, I think, and we have brought each other back to life." Spring arrived in a rush of green. The prairie, so recently a desolate expanse of white, burst forth with new grass and wild flowers. The air grew soft and warm, filled with the scent of damp earth and the songs of meadowlarks. The transformation of the land was a reflection of the transformation within the walls of the small cabin. Isaac and Winona's life settled into a new rhythm, one of shared work and quiet joy. He taught her the ways of the ranch, how to read the clouds for rain, how to gauge the health of a calf. She, in turn, taught him things he never knew he needed to learn. She taught him the names of the prairie plants in her language, which were good for medicine and which for dye. She taught him patience, showing him how to sit in stillness and simply observe the world around him. They were building a life together, piece by piece, a mosaic of two different worlds, creating a new, beautiful pattern. The twins thrived. They grew from fragile infants into robust, curious toddlers. Chaitan, serious and watchful, followed Isaac everywhere, his small hand gripping Isaac's finger, his blue eyes studying everything his surrogate father did. Wachiwi, full of laughter and light, was her mother's shadow, chattering in a mix of English and Lakota words, her small body constantly in motion. One bright summer afternoon, Isaac stood on the porch, leaning against a post, watching them. Winona was in the meadow with the children, showing them a monarch butterfly that had landed on a milkweed plant. Wachiwi clapped her hands in delight, her laughter carrying on the warm breeze. Chaitan reached out a tentative finger to touch the butterfly's wing, his face a mask of intense concentration. Isaac watched the scene, a feeling of peace so profound it felt like a prayer settling over him. Winona looked up and caught his eye. She smiled, a radiant, open smile that reached deep inside him and healed the last of the old wounds. In that moment, he saw his entire future. It was not the future he had once planned with Mary, but it was a future filled with a love and contentment he had never imagined possible. He looked at his children, he thought, the word feeling completely right in his heart, and saw their eyes. He no longer saw the ghost of his dead wife. He no longer saw a painful reminder of his own loss. He saw Chaitan's fierce loyalty. He saw Wachiwi's boundless joy. He saw the living, breathing evidence of resilience, of hope, and of the incredible, unexpected ways a life could be rebuilt. The lonely cowboy had found the woman and her twins in a snowstorm, and in saving them, he had finally found his way home. His own blue eyes, reflected in theirs, were no longer haunted by the past, but filled with the brilliant light of the present.